3 John is where we are. Those joining us by way of technology, those of us already here in person, we're in 3 John verse number 4. Our objective tonight, I don't think we'll finish up 3 John this evening. We'll probably reserve the last part of 3 John for next Wednesday, and then we'll start Jude. We'll introduce Jude, which is again a short book, a little bit longer than 2nd or 3rd John, and then we'll go from there. But we'll see how far we can get this evening in 3 John. Be making your way there if you're not there already. So last Wednesday evening we introduced 3 John, noted that this is another letter written by John. Again, it is a short, one of the 5 one-chapter books of the Bible. And we also pointed out that one easy way to outline 3 John is around the 3 men mentioned in the letter. The first man is, depending on how you pronounce it, Gaius or Gaius. And John addresses him in verses 1 to 8. And then he talks about Diotrephes, verses 9 through 11. And then rounding out with Demetrius, verses 12 through 14. So that helps me see sort of the layout of this letter. And so we're looking at it from that viewpoint. First of all, the encouragement of Gaius, verses 1 through 8. Adam, if you will, read for us verses 1 to 4. We'll sort of rewind and make a couple of comments and then go starting in verse 4. But read for us verses 1 to 4.
The elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth.
So from that reading, you get the idea that John had a good feeling toward Gaius. He calls him well-beloved or beloved. He says, I love him, beloved, verse 2. He'll say beloved, verse 5. And so a warm relationship between this apostle, this older apostle, and this younger disciple of Christ. Evidently, Gaius did have some problems though, right? What may have been a couple of problems he had? Health problems. He evidently had some health issues. And probably some financial issues too. And Mary, I somehow left your name off the list. Your surgery went well? Okay, good. I saw your head a while ago and I said, I don't have Mary's name on here, but there's her head. But she's doing better. I don't know how I left that off, but anyway, glad Mary's surgery went well. I know Tandy told me about that. Now back to Gaius. He evidently had some financial problems and maybe some health problems, and we get that from what verse?
Verse 2.
Verse 2. In other words, my prayer for you is, I wish you were as well off physically and financially as you are spiritually. You get the idea that this Gaius was doing very well spiritually. He was prospering spiritually, and there were some issues maybe health-wise and maybe financial-wise too. So the main thing is, again, John commends him for his soul prospering, and that's what we want too. We'd much rather have a soul prospering than have a lot of money in the bank and have the best of health. It'd be better to have a soul that is prospering. And then some brothers had come to John and told him a report of Gaius, the fact that Gaius was a Christian and he was living what he believed in his life. He did walk in the truth, which leads us up to now to verse 4. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. No greater joy. Now stop and think about that for a moment. What are some things that bring people joy? Just in general, people in the world. What are some things that bring people joy? Gifts. This is a time of year of gift giving, isn't it? And who doesn't like to get a present and wonder what's on the inside and then to open it up? And that, I know kids count down Christmas almost the day after Christmas till the next one comes around. So that certainly This is a season of joy, as it's often called. What are some other things that bring people joy in life? Health, having good health. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. We all would want good health. I think we take it for granted. I know I do. But in other words, someday we'll lose that if we live long enough. Spending time with family and friends. Some would say money brings them joy. Some would say wealth and power and prestige. Some would say just a hike up a mountain trail brings me a lot of joy, or a quiet walk along the beach brings me a lot of joy. Sitting by a fireside on a cold winter night. How about that? We've got a fireplace, but it's a whole lot easier just to watch that on the TV, the Yule log that burns, right? A whole lot easier to just to watch that. Not quite as warm though, is it? But anyway, a lot of things bring us joy, and there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But for John, his greatest joy was, there's nothing greater than to hear that my children walk in the truth. Now this phrase, no greater joy, is what is called by some a double comparative, equivalent to our saying more better. Now that's not good English, more better, but that, for emphasis' sake, is the original here, redundancy, just to express from John the feeling in his heart to hear that Gaius and others are faithful Christians. Now the question is, how could these have been John's children? He calls them my children. How could they have been his kids?
Might have helped establish the congregation.
Might have helped establish, probably not his literal offspring. Probably, and he may have actually helped convert some of them too.
I have a comment of mine that says it probably refers to the people that John led to Christ.
Right.
You know, to bring
Right.
them into his family.
And how did Paul describe Timothy? My own son in the faith. Not my son in the flesh, but my son in the faith. So that may very well have been the reason, not his literal offspring physically, but perhaps he had led them to Christ and Christians. And so a teacher's greatest joy, one of a teacher's greatest joys is seeing a student later in life and knowing that student has succeeded. I know Linda has taught and Tanya teaches and Adam is teaching. He's just sort of getting started doing that. Tanya's taught for 35 years, and in 35 years she has taught hundreds, if not thousands, of students. And as I've said before, when we go to Walmart, invariably she's going to see some of the students that she has taught, and rightly so, and it thrills her to see some of the students that she taught doing well. That, to some extent, is a good reflection on whom? Her. To some extent, that's a good reflection on her. Some of her students, in turn, became teachers themselves. In fact, one of her students became a teacher and is taught at ICC and is about to retire. Somebody she taught the student is about to retire, and she's still working.
She's old too.
Somebody would say there's something wrong with that picture, right? I mean, somebody you've taught is retiring and you're still working. Well, to each his own, I guess. But again, those of you who teach understand what John is saying here, and certainly preachers and teachers of the gospel, people that you helped convert years ago, and get news from them that they're doing fine, that maybe they became a preacher, or they're a Bible class teacher, or they're on fire for the Lord. People you perform weddings for, still happily married years later. That just gives you a good feeling. What about parents and their children? You know, parents are proud of the achievements in life of their children. And for Christian parents, the proudest moment of all in their children's life is what? When they became Christians themselves. You're a Christian, and to see my children become Christians, that's the greatest day of all. Now, unfortunately, The flip side of all that is what? Also true. In other words, it is a measure of great sadness when somebody that you baptized has no use for the church, is millions of miles away from the church. That is certainly a sad thing. Somebody that you helped to marry, and they're now not together. I know when I first started preaching, my motto was, when I marry somebody, I'm going to tie the knots so tight they couldn't get divorced if they wanted to. Well, that's wishful thinking, isn't it? Because, sad to say, several that I have performed the wedding for are now no longer together. Is that my fault? I hope not. I don't see how it could be just because I performed the wedding. And I told them, we set the office face to face, do not come to me telling me that you're not going to stay together anymore. Well, they didn't come to me, but they didn't stay together anymore. So, it really is a sad thing. So it's a great thing, no greater joy than to hear that those that you have helped to convert are still faithful Christians, and that is what John says of Gaius and others. Now let's round out this section talking about Gaius, Adam, verses 5 through 8.
Beloved, thou doest faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers, which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom if thou bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well, because that for his name's sake they went forth taking nothing of the Gentiles. We therefore ought to receive such, that we might be fellow helpers to the truth.
Now back in verse number 4, we just read, and earlier verse 3, Gaius was walking in the truth. And this verse tells us one way Gaius was walking in the truth, because he was one who extended hospitality to traveling missionaries. Talked about this in 2 John. One problem that lady had was she would welcome into her home anybody who knocked on her door, and didn't take the time to consider, is this person true or false? And she was welcoming and aiding and abetting false teachers unknowingly, and John addressed that. Gaius, on the other hand, was one likewise who would be hospitable to these traveling missionaries, but he was discerning. He didn't just help anybody. He would not aid false teachers on their way. And that's what verse 5 is all about. When he does faithfully whatever he does to the brethren and to strangers. This would involve cost. Usually, if you invite somebody into your home, not only do you give them a place to stay, you also give them what? Food. I mean, sort of awkward. You sitting there at a table eating a meal, and you've invited your guest, and he's sitting off there in the corner watching you eat. You're not going to do that. You're going to not only give him a place to stay, you're going to give him food. That's going to involve cost, obviously. Most Christians then were not well-to-do. Most were, like I guess a lot of us, struggled in some ways. And certainly in that day, it would not be a convenient thing to have a stranger or even somebody you knew come and stay a few days, weeks with you. Obviously, no indoor plumbing then. You didn't have 2 bathrooms or 3. You didn't even have 1. No plumbing at all. Usually their homes, the living space was 1 room. A lot of times houses then had one room, but you made do. They made do. And that's what Gaius did in spite of the difficulty. And we talked about, when we looked at 2 John, again, hospitality, the need for hospitality. You could read about Elisha, I believe it was. He came to that widow, and they were on the brink of starvation. Remember 2 Kings 4, wasn't it? And she said, Elisha said, bring me something to eat. She said, I've got a little flour here, and I've got a little oil here, and I'm going to make a cake for me and my son. We're going to eat it, and then what? We're going to die. I mean, that's just how bad the famine was. And Elisha said, well, I'll tell you what, you go and make the cake and bake it and so forth, and give it to me first. And she did. Now that's hospitality, isn't it? And of course Elisha saw to it. I always get Elijah and Elisha confused. I believe that's Elisha. They sound an awful lot alike, but I believe that's Elisha. But anyway, that was hospitality. She gave him the cake, and of course he kept them alive because of her faith. Now, obviously, we want to be hospitable today, and most today we have monetary means whereby we can help people. But again, we want to be discerning. At the same time, we want to be careful. I had Brother James Pilgrim with us this Sunday, and we're thankful for the excellent job he did and always does when he's with us. We were hospitable to him, and we took him out for a meal. And as we were leaving the eating establishment, there was a fellow sitting in one of the rocking chairs, said, "Got some money you could lend me or give me?" He didn't say lend me. "Have a few extra dollars." It's amazing how at the time you don't think. And that's one of those where I didn't think moments. They've got now hiring signs plastered all over that eating establishment. Got a few, the response would have been, "Hey, see the sign, now hiring?" This guy was a lot fitter than I was, a lot younger than I was, rocking away in that rocking chair. "You want some money? Go right in there and get to work. I know they'll hire you." But I didn't think about that. But we don't give cash. And Brother Pilgrim didn't, I didn't either. We try to help people, but you get to the point where I don't keep cash on me, number one. And if I did, I just say I don't have any to spare. I don't say I don't have any. If I've got some on me, I don't say I don't lie. I just say I don't have any to spare, and I really don't have any to spare. So there are different ways of being hospitable, and we don't want certainly to foster on a lifestyle that people could, if they wanted to, get out of. But that's another lesson. Again, Gaius was a hospitable man, especially to traveling missionaries. These are fellows going from place to place preaching the gospel. They don't have a home in this city. They need a place to stay, and they need food to eat. And we certainly would be obviously willing to help those in that position as well, and do. Verse 6, again, "These have come to John, telling John about Gaius." And they know that John wants to know about Gaius because evidently he was one of John's converts and the great love they have for one another. And so in this report they give, "They have borne witness of thy charity before the church," or your love before the church. And that's great, John says, but the mission work isn't over. And so keep it up. That's what he's saying at the end of verse 6. "Whom if thou bring forward on their journey," talking about these missionaries, "after a godly sort, thou shalt do well." Again, the concept of bringing them on their journey, the journey they're traveling, preaching the gospel. The phrase "bringing them forward" meant helping them to go forward in their journey. You don't want it to be that the town they arrive in is the last place they can go because they run out of food or money or whatever. So you want to keep the cycle going. You want to be able to help them to go to the next town. A lot of times in that day, not only did you help them monetarily, if you could go to the next town, a lot of times they would walk with them at least part of the way to the next town. Maybe as a bit of security, a bit of companionship, encouragement. But that phrase, "bringing them forward on their journey," involved a lot. And this after a godly sort, that is, in a manner worthy of God, doing the right thing with the right attitude. If I show hospitality to somebody, all the while I'm gritting under my teeth, hating what I'm doing, what is that? That's it. I might as well not do it, right? What kind of giver does God love? A cheerful giver. So I want to help others, not begrudging the fact that I'm helping them, but glad to be able to help them. I may have told this before, but sometimes missionaries have to be very thick thick-skinned, I guess like Christians in general really, but some of them will say, and sort of if it weren't so serious, it's hilarious about some of the items, some of the care items they get over there from over here. People will send them clothes that are ripped, that are torn, that are filthy. And sometimes they say they'll sort of get together over there and have a costume party. They'll put on those clothes that people from over here have sent them that are torn and ripped, and they'll just sit around and laugh at each other. That is sad. Now that is awfully sad. That's another lesson. That's not showing hospitality after a godly sort, in other words. Gaius wasn't like that. You have helped others. Keep it up, Gaius. Keep up the good work you're doing. Because, verse 7, why support them? Because that for his name's sake they went forth. These are missionaries going out for the name of Christ. They're worthy of your help. Notice, though, that these missionaries did not take support from whom? The Gentiles. They took nothing of the Gentiles, or unbelievers, or pagans. Now, the why of this could have been, this might have hindered the gospel of Christ. In other words, if you put a sign out or knock a door saying, I need money to go to such and such place to preach, unbelievers might get the idea that all you're preaching for is what? Money. That probably was the reason why they took nothing of those who didn't understand what they were doing. And so we're not going to hinder the gospel by doing that. And so we're certainly not charging for preaching the gospel. We'll just take from those who are believers. Now, if you keep up with the TV evangelists of the day, some of them at least, from whom do they solicit money? Anybody who will give it, right? Believer, unbeliever, atheist, satanic, they don't care. Just send in your money and we'll send the blessing. And what a stark contrast between them and these here who are Christians who are sincere. So verse 8, we therefore ought to receive such. Who's the such? We ought to receive such.
Those that are going around preaching.
Right. These traveling missionaries. We ought to, Christians that is, ought to show hospitality. And certainly we ought to today, as we have opportunity, help those who are missionaries who go from place to place. And as we do that, what are we? What does that make us, John says? A fellow helper to the truth. So, it takes some to go, but it also takes some to send. People cannot go unless other people send. And those who send, true or false, those who send are just as vital as those who go. True. You can't have one without the other. Everybody cannot go. Let me read a couple of lines here from William Barclay. I've talked about him before. I have the set of commentaries in my library. Whenever you read a commentary, you read it with a grain of salt, or take it with a grain of salt, because the man's not inspired. And Barclay, you love him one minute, and you want to just hit him upside the head the next minute, because he's so far off on some things and so right on some things. He's so right here. And in this, he says, there's a great Christian thought. A man's circumstances may be such that he cannot become a missionary or a preacher. Life may have put him in a position where he must get on with a secular job, staying in the one place and carrying out the routine duties of life and living. But where he cannot go, his money and his prayers and his practical support can go. Not everyone can be, so to speak, on the front line. But by supporting those who are there, he can make himself an ally of the truth. When we remember that, All giving to the wider work of Christ and His church must become not an obligation but a privilege, not a duty but a delight. The church needs those who will go out with the truth, but it also needs those who will be allies of the truth at home. Agree? Isn't that what John is saying here? Traveling missionaries are doing their part. Gaius, you do your part in helping them to go. We certainly praise those who are missionaries overseas or in the States, but by the same token, we ought to praise those who help those missionaries go overseas or in the States or wherever. So both are vital. Any of your thoughts as we wrap up verses 1 to 8, the encouragement of Gaius or Gaius? Well, now we shift gears. And it would be great, I know John would say the same thing if he didn't have to write verses 9 through 11. But again, everything is not ideal or as we would wish, even in the church. Now the criticism of Diotrephes, verses 9 through 11. Some call him Diotrephes the dictator. He's exhorted and commended Gaius, and now this description of Diotrephes. It would be great to have a church full of people like Gaius, right? But you would not want one single Diotrephes. You don't want even one Diotrephes in the church. How many apples does it take to ruin a whole bag? One apple can, it doesn't always happen, but one apple, one potato. Ever open a bag of potatoes you put away and you forgot they were there, and you look at that and you throw it away because of the smell. You know, there's a rotten potato in there. Well, Diotrephes is the rotten apple or the rotten potato in this particular congregation. He's bad news. And now Adam, read for us verses 9 through 11. 3 John 9 through 11.
I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he doeth, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith. Neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God.
Okay, back up to verse 9. I wrote a letter. Now the question is, what was this letter? And the answer is, we really don't know. Some say it was 2 John. I don't know. There may be good reason for that, but I don't see any evidence that he's talking about the letter of 2 John in this verse. A lot of folks believe this is another letter he wrote that for whatever reason God did not preserve in Scripture. I think we understand that everything that these men of God wrote was not a part of Scripture. When Peter wrote a letter to his mother, well, God didn't preserve that in Scripture. There was no need for that. So everything they wrote was not inspired. Everything they wrote was not inspired, but what they wrote that was inspired is in Scripture, if I've made that clear as mud.
Could that have been written to confirm? They have John's signature saying that these men are preachers of the truth, which is why he wrote.
Right.
That's the whole purpose of why he's writing, to clearly distinguish that these are people that teach the truth, right, versus those who don't.
Right. That could very well be. In fact, I hadn't thought about that, but that seems to make better sense than anything that I'd even thought of. Good point. Very good point. So whatever this is, John, he wrote to the church, of which Diotrephes was a member. Now we wonder, was Gaius a member of the same congregation that Diotrephes was? And if he was, why would John have to inform Gaius of something that Gaius already knows about? Would be a question to ask. And so some believe Gaius was a member of a neighboring congregation down the road, maybe not the same one that Diotrephes was. Some things we just don't know about all this. John says, I wrote a letter to the church, but Diotrephes, and we don't know much about Diotrephes. If I'm correct, if my Bible software is correct, this is the only time in the Bible his name is mentioned. And it's not mentioned in a good light, by the way. Some believe he would have been of Greek origin because of his very name. And he was some type of leader in the congregation where he was a member. Maybe he was one of the elders. We're just speculating about that. But Diotrephes' problem was he loved to have the preeminence. What on earth is that? Hard to pick a better word than boss. He wants to be the boss, right? He wants the preeminence. That word literally means to be first. He loved to be first. He wants to be in control. Somebody described him as power hungry. Power hungry. Now, in a lesson not long ago, we talked about the 4 basic types of personalities that people have. Type A, B, C, and D, and then there are animal terms that go with the types: lion, otter, beaver, and so forth. Which of those type personalities would Diotrephes have been? Type A, the lion. And then some. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being a lion, but there's something wrong with letting that get out of hand. He was a domineering person, to say the least. He wanted control. He wanted the preeminence. If you look at Colossians 1:18, we see what's wrong with wanting preeminence. Going to Colossians 1:18. Somebody look at Colossians 1:18 and tell me what's wrong with Diotrephes wanting the preeminence. In all things, he's the head of the body, talking about Jesus. He's the head of the body of the church. Jesus is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. That in all things he, Jesus, not Diotrephes, in all things, even in the church, Jesus might have first place. Diotrephes said, I want first place. Jesus said, I want first place. And there is the problem. He is number one in his mind. He wants to be served. He doesn't want to be a servant. Can you imagine Diotrephes washing anybody's feet? That was a task reserved for a servant. I can't imagine. He's too big in his mind for that. And just imagine being a member of the congregation where he is, in his mind, number one. The pressure would be tremendous to give in to him, right? I mean, if you don't give in to him, you're going to have all sorts of trouble. And so people would bend over backwards at times. It's too much trouble to resist somebody like that. Just let him have his own way. And the problem with that is it's simply not biblical. You know, somebody has to stand up to bullies. And he was a bully. Who's going to stand up to Diotrephes? John's going to. We'll see that in just a moment. At times, even the disciples of Jesus were struck with the disease of Diotrephes. They constantly argued among themselves which of them would be the greatest. In essence, we want to be preeminent. Jesus said the greatest of all is the one who's least of all. Again, talking about the servant mentality. Are there cases of Diotrephes today? Know anybody like that at work? If you work in a big enough place, you probably know a Diotrephes or two at work. And they're not hard to spot. And as long, again, as you let them run over you and have their way, you get along fine. But the minute you buck them or disagree with an idea they have, well, you made a mistake, at least in their mind. I remember a congregation Dad preached at years ago. I've probably told this before. There were actually 2 older women who were the Diotrephes in that congregation. Don't think that only a man can be a Diotrephes. These were 2 older women, and they basically ruled the congregation. The reason was, guess why? Money. They were rich, very rich. And they put money into the plate, and they didn't mind letting people know they put a lot of money in the plate. But whenever they didn't get their way on something, the contribution, guess what? Went down. They didn't think the song leader ought to lead singing because he didn't mow his yard. And guess what? He eventually wasn't leading singing. And Dad didn't preach there long. It's hard to put up with a situation like that, and nobody wanted to take a stand because, again, the worry is, what will we do if they stop giving? Well, put your faith in the Lord is what you do. Things will work out. And that congregation does not exist today at all. Just a broken down building years ago. I'm sure it's been bulldozed now. Diotrephes loved to have the preeminence, and he received us not, and the us would include John, an apostle of God, apostolic authority. What John says is coming directly from heaven, and Diotrephes has the audacity to buck an apostle of God. John wrote a letter. Evidently, Diotrephes got the letter, may have ripped it to shreds. A letter from an apostle of God. John is a threat to Diotrephes because John is an apostle. And Diotrephes is a church dictator, and John's going to challenge him. And we'll pick up in verse 10 then for next week. 3 John 10. We'll talk about Diotrephes and then wrap up talking about a better man, much better man by the name of Demetrius.